Puyi, the last emperor of China, lived a crazy life. Plucked from his home as a toddler and declared a living god, he was dragged kicking and screaming to the Forbidden City and thrust onto the throne, where he would continue more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. On the outside, he was a refined and cultured man who spent years living in unimaginable luxury and decadence. But behind closed doors, his life was a nightmare. So in this video, we're counting down the 8 craziest facts about the last emperor. Coming in at number 8, he was kidnapped and put on the throne. As the nephew of the Emperor of China, Puyi lived a charmed life from the moment he was born on February 7, 1906. But when he was still a baby, his life changed in the blink of an eye, and he suffered a lifelong trauma. In November of 1908, his uncle passed away without an heir, leaving the Chinese throne up for grabs. In order to avoid throwing the kingdom into turmoil, the powerful Dowager Empress Cixi hastily elected Puyi as the next emperor. For many people, this immense power would be a dream come true. But for a 3-year-old boy, it was incredibly traumatic. Without any notice or warning, palace guards marched into Puyi's home, informing his parents that he was a new ruler and that he had to go to the royal residences in the Forbidden City immediately. They tore the little boy from the only life he'd ever known, and then baptized him into one he barely understood. Puyi tried to fight against his captors, screaming at them when they tried to pick him up and crying that he didn't want to leave his mother and father. But the worst part about all of this was the reaction from his parents, who coldly ignored his emotional breakdown. They just stood there watching silently as the guards stuffed their only son into a palanquin and left. Number 7, cruelty became his entertainment. While Puyi experienced a lot of trauma in his early life, he was also spoiled rotten. Every day his ceremonial eunuch servants would prepare him meals full of every imaginable delicacy, and he would receive swaths of luxurious clothing since an emperor never wore an item of clothing more than once. As a little boy who never heard the word no, he eventually caught on to the fact that he had absolute power as a supreme leader, and it corrupted him in the most horrific ways imaginable. He went mad with power and took a particular interest in humiliating his eunuchs whenever he could. At first, he would have them beat for even the smallest things that displeased him, but soon enough his taste grew more sadistic. It was said that Puyi loved watching his eunuchs get flogged and spent many hours of his reign observing this horrific event. For him, it was considered the best kind of entertainment. When he got bored of that, he would even fire pellets from his air gun at them. During one incident, the boy emperor wanted to feed one of his eunuchs a cake made with iron fillings because he said he wanted to see what it looks like when he eats it. Thankfully, his wet nurse at the time talked him out of it, but that just goes to show you the extent of his cruelty. Coming in at number 6, he tried to run away. As a teenager, Puyi had grown obsessed with the modern West. He loved Harold Lloyd films, cut off his long hair, and liked to ride his bicycle around the Forbidden City. But there was one particular obsession that he just couldn't shake, and it was the University of Oxford, the school of his beloved British tutor Reginald Johnston. To the Emperor, culture began and ended with this school, and he was intent on becoming an Oxford student. He fantasized about living another life, like a character in one of his favorite movies. And as his wedding date approached, this obsession turned into desperation. Within months of getting engaged to one wrong, he hatched an infamous plan. Puyi woke up on the morning of June 4th, 1922, intent on escaping the Forbidden City and meeting his destiny as a college student. He even planned to print out an open letter addressed to his people, where he would renounce his title. But he made one big mistake. He was so proud of his plot that he went and told his tutor everything, and then he asked him to call him a cab and come with him. Johnston could see how ridiculous this plan was right away and how it would never work. So he took a stand and refused to call a taxi for the emperor. Now you might be thinking, why would this stop him from leaving? Couldn't he just find another way to leave the Forbidden City? Well, surprisingly, no. You see, Puyi was extremely sheltered. In fact, he was so terrified at the idea of going into the streets of Beijing alone that he gave up his mission immediately. Number 5, his wedding was a disaster. It's no real surprise that Puyi's horrendous childhood rendered him pretty much incapable of emotional maturity, and he really showed it on his wedding day. The fact that he literally tried to run away from it tells you a whole lot about his feelings at the time. The emperor had such little interest in his wife that he said seeing her walk into his imperial wedding was one of the first times he ever felt curious about what she looked like. But Wanrong couldn't have been thrilled either, because soon after the ceremony, she learned that she was not his one and only. You see, Puyi had someone else in mind at the time of their engagement. 12-year-old Wengzhu, who was his first choice as a bride, though advisors convinced him out of it given that she was not an age-appropriate match. But Puyi could not give her up, so he decided to take Wenzhou as his secondary consort, and marry her on the same day that he wed Wanrong. As you can probably imagine, their wedding night was a disaster. After the ceremonies, the three of them went to the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, where for centuries emperors had consummated their unions. Wanrong and Wenzhou laid down on the mattress, and that's when things took a very strange turn. Apparently, the moment that Puyi entered the room and saw both of them laying there, he ran right out. To this day, historians can't be sure what exactly drove him to flee, but according to the rumors, it was more than just his teenage immaturity. This brings us to number 4. His bedroom life was scandalous. The one downside to being an emperor has to be the complete lack of privacy, even when it comes to matters as sensitive as your sex life. One of the emperor's eunuchs reluctantly confessed one day that he would only visit his wife's room once every 3 months, and he would leave early in the morning the next day, and for the rest of the day he had a horrible temper. It was said that their physicality lacked passion. After a while, their unhappiness became impossible to hide, which is when the rumors started piling on. Even people closest to Puyi believed that he had desires for men, because he said that he preferred the land way to the water way when it came to his romances, though exactly what he meant by that is still up for interpretation. Number 3, his wives were enemies. You know what they say, 2 is company and 3 is a crowd. Well, it was exactly like that for Puyi's wives Wanrong and Wenzhou, who quickly developed an intense rivalry with each other, and things got very petty very fast. After learning that her husband had a preference for Wenzhou, Wanrong sent her tons of scathing letters, most likely taking shots at her for stealing his affections. Wenzhou wrote her back and criticized all of the typos that she had received in the letter. So yeah, there was a distinct lack of maturity with these fights. When the imperial couple became newly private citizens, they moved to a villa in the city of Tianjin called the Garden of Serenity. This was supposed to be a fresh start for their marriage and a way to smooth over the tense relationship between the two women. But somehow things got even worse. The two wives were now so bored out of their minds in their new home that they started to compete even more violently for Puyi's affections. They would get extremely jealous if he didn't buy them identical gifts or pay them equal attention. And the list went on and on. Number 2, he could not take care of himself. When Puyi eventually converted to communism, it took an intense toll on his body. In order to try and remodel him, Chairman Mao's men threw the emperor into a prison, where conditions were extremely harsh compared to the lavish lifestyle he had become accustomed to. Right away, it became apparent just how little basic life skills he really had. For the first time in his royal existence, people expected Puyi to take care of himself, which included simple tasks like brushing his teeth and tying his shoes. The things you and I wouldn't think twice about, he had never done before. Not just that, but it was said that until his dying day, the emperor was incredibly clumsy. According to one observer, he invariably forgot to close doors behind him, forgot to flush the toilet, forgot to turn the tap off after washing his hands, and had a genius for creating an instant disorderly mess around him. Because clearly he had never learned to pick up after himself. And we all know bad habits die hard, but that wasn't all. As a prisoner, there was no reason for anyone to walk on eggshells around him anymore, and there was no one left in his life to kowtow to him too. So the other inmates would often ridicule him for how useless he was on his own. Aside from that, his guards also forced him to face all of his wrongdoings as a ruler, confronting him with the families and the landscapes that he had helped destroy while he was in charge. By this point, the tables had really turned, and Puyi was finally getting his comeuppance for the horrors that he had inflicted on other people. Now that is something you could call pure karma. And coming in at number 1, he became a normal man. The later years of Puyi's life brought a change in him that no one could have predicted. The once cruel and flippant ruler started to become remorseful and overcome with grief. He apparently spent a great deal of time reflecting on his actions and learning from his errors. In December of 1959, he left his remodeling camp and lived in Beijing as a completely normal citizen. When he entered public life, people just couldn't believe their eyes. Shockingly, Puyi even got a job as a street sweeper. but of course he stood out like a sore thumb. On the first day of his job, he lost his way and had to tell people, "I'm Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. I'm staying with relatives and can't find my way home." As funny as that sounds, his efforts to become a normal man seemed earnest. Well, that's all the facts that we have for this video. Please let us know in the comments below which fact was your favorite. And be sure to like and subscribe to Factinate for more interesting videos like this one.